Avoidants don't fear closeness. They fear losing themselves inside it. Avoidants commit when intimacy doesn't feel like a takeover, because for them, closeness has never been neutral. It has always come with an invisible price. Somewhere early in their life, connection became linked with obligation, emotional responsibility, or the quiet expectation to become something for someone else. So when they enter adult relationships, their nervous system is constantly scanning not for love, but for loss of self. The moment they sense expectations stacking, emotional monitoring, or pressure to perform connection in a specific way, their body reacts before their mind can explain it. Their system doesn't register romance, it registers capture. Not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because their internal wiring interprets closeness as a slow erosion of freedom. This is why avoidance can feel drawn to someone deeply and still pull away without warning. Attraction doesn't disappear, safety does. What most people misunderstand is that reassurance doesn't solve this. Saying, I won't trap you, I'm not like that, or you don't have to worry, actually keeps the threat active because it keeps the focus on the possibility of entanglement. The trigger that softens an avoidant isn't words, it's space that doesn't feel like distance. It's room that isn't passive, aggressive, conditional, or temporary. It's the lived experience of being close to someone who still clearly belongs to themselves. When you have a full life, they're not managing, not monitoring, not subconsciously responsible for, something shifts inside them. When your sense of meaning, fulfillment, and emotional regulation doesn't rise and fall based on their availability, their body finally relaxes. Not because they feel less important, but because they feel less dangerous to you and therefore less endangered by you. Autonomy is not neglect, it's stability without intrusion. Avoidance feels safest with people who don't orbit them emotionally, who don't track their responses for proof of connection, and who don't require constant reassurance to feel secure. When you move through your life with direction, purpose, and emotional steadiness, you stop feeling like a vacuum pulling them inward. You start feeling like a solid presence beside them. This distinction matters more than chemistry, because chemistry without autonomy feels like pressure. But chemistry paired with autonomy feels optional, and choice is everything to an avoidant nervous system. This is where commitment begins to reframe itself for them. Commitment doesn't feel like a cage. When they don't sense themselves being absorbed into someone else's emotional world, it starts to feel like an expansion rather than a contraction. They can imagine staying because staying doesn't mean shrinking. They can imagine investing because investing doesn't require surrendering their inner territory. Your independence becomes proof, not of detachment, but of emotional maturity. It signals that closeness with you won't cost them their identity, their pace, or their inner freedom. And this is why trying to secure an avoidant through closeness alone backfires. The more someone leans in without a grounded center, the more the avoidance system prepares to escape. But when closeness is offered without demand, when presence is steady without surveillance, something unfamiliar happens. The avoidant stops bracing. They stop anticipating the moment they'll need to pull away to breathe. They begin to feel safe enough to stay longer than usual, not because they're convinced, but because nothing inside them is screaming to leave. Autonomy is the first doorway to commitment because it removes the primary threat. It tells their nervous system, you don't have to disappear here. And when an avoidant believes they can remain whole inside connection, commitment stops being a risk they manage and starts becoming a choice they're willing to explore. Not rushed, not forced, but the safest thing to an avoidant is someone who can hold their own emotions. Avoidants didn't become distant because they don't feel they became distant because early on, emotion became something they had to manage rather than something they were allowed to experience. In many cases, they learned that other people's feelings came with expectations to fix, to soothe, to stay calm, or to not make things worse. Over time, a quiet equation formed in their nervous system: other people's emotions equal responsibility. And responsibility, when it arrives without choice, feels like pressure. So in adult relationships, they aren't reacting to emotion itself. They're reacting to the fear that your internal state will soon become their job. This is why their system reacts so strongly to mood dependency when your emotional state rises and falls based on their texts, their tone, or their availability, it sends a signal their body recognizes instantly. Anxiety tied to their behavior doesn't feel like closeness to them. It feels like a weight, subtle emotional bargaining, even when unspoken, feels like a contract they never agreed to sign. When they sense that their presence stabilizes you and their absence destabilizes you, their instinct isn't compassion, it's distance. Not because they don't care, but because caring feels like a trap they can't safely enter. What creates safety for an avoidant is emotional self-sufficiency, not emotional numbness, not pretending not to care, but the ability to feel without flooding, to process without outsourcing regulation. When you can experience disappointment without collapsing, sadness without accusing, and desire without urgency, something inside them shifts. They don't feel drafted into your emotional world. They feel invited. An invitation is voluntary. It's the difference between I need you to be okay and I'm okay and I want you here. One feels heavy, the other feels safe. Avoidants are especially sensitive to urgency because urgency implies consequence. When needs are expressed with pressure, even subtle pressure, their system hears if you don't respond correctly, something bad happens. That's when shutdown begins. But when needs are expressed calmly, clearly, and without emotional leverage, they register something unfamiliar. You're not bargaining for reassurance. You're not testing their availability. You're simply stating truth. This removes the hidden demand from the interaction, and without hidden demand, their defenses lower. Self-soothing without withdrawing love is one of the most powerful signals you can send to an avoidant. When you don't punish them emotionally for needing space, and you don't disappear to protect yourself, you communicate stability. You show them that emotional regulation doesn't require control, neither yours nor theirs. This rewires the old association they carry, the one that says closeness leads to exhaustion. Instead, a new belief begins to form quietly. Closeness doesn't cost me. It doesn't drain me. It doesn't turn me into a caretaker or a regulator of someone else's inner world. This is where commitment begins to feel possible. Avoidants don't resist commitment because they fear love. They resist commitment because they fear becoming responsible for someone else's emotional equilibrium. When that fear dissolves, even slightly, they soften. They become more present, more consistent, more willing to stay engaged during moments that would normally trigger withdrawal. Not because they're trying harder, but because their nervous system isn't sounding an alarm. Emotional self-sufficiency changes the entire dynamic. It removes the invisible burden that makes avoidance pull away. It allows them to experience intimacy without bracing for emotional labor. And in that safety, commitment stops feeling like a dangerous obligation and starts feeling like a shared experience, one they can enter without losing themselves. Avoidants don't trust intensity, they trust consistency. For an avoidant, intensity doesn't read as passion. It reads as instability. Big emotional swings, dramatic expressions of closeness, and sudden surges of affection don't land as romantic gestures, they land as spikes. Spikes signal unpredictability, and unpredictability signals threat. Even positive intensity can feel unsafe when their nervous system is trained to associate emotional highs with future demands or crashes. So while many people believe that more emotion creates more security, for avoidance, it often does the opposite. It activates vigilance, not bonding. What actually creates safety for them is predictability without control. A stable presence that doesn't fluctuate based on proximity. Clear patterns of behavior that don't change depending on whether they lean in or pull back. No emotional whiplash that forces them to constantly recalibrate how close is safe. When your energy stays grounded, whether they're present or distant, their system starts to settle. They're no longer trying to anticipate emotional consequences. They're no longer bracing for the moment. Intensity turns into expectation. Avoidants are especially sensitive to shifts in behavior tied to their closeness. When someone becomes warmer only when they pursue or colder when they need space, it creates a reward and punishment loop. Even if unintentional, it feels like control. Their nervous system reads, "My behavior determines your emotional state." And that instantly brings back the old fear of responsibility. But when your behavior doesn't change based on their closeness, when you don't punish distance or reward pursuit, something profound happens. They stop scanning for traps. They stop trying to manage the dynamic. They begin to relax into it. Consistency doesn't mean being constantly available. It means being emotionally coherent. Your tone, care, and respect remain intact. Whether they text immediately or take time, you don't escalate intimacy when they move closer, and you don't withdraw warmth when they step back. This neutrality isn't indifference, it's regulation. And regulation is what makes connection feel safe for someone who is wired to expect emotional volatility. Over time, this consistency teaches their nervous system something it didn't learn early on. Closeness doesn't come with unpredictable consequences. There's no sudden demand hiding behind affection, no emotional debt accumulating quietly, no moment where stability flips into pressure. Instead, there's a steady rhythm, and rhythm is calming. It allows the avoidant to stay present without preparing an exit. This is why grand gestures often backfire with avoidance. They feel like peaks that will require valleys. They anticipate the drop, the shift, the expectation that follows. But when connection grows slowly, evenly, and without dramatic surges, trust has time to form. Not intellectual trust, somatic trust. The kind that lives in the body and says, I know what happens if I stay. And that knowing reduces the need to leave. Predictability without control gives them a sense of agency. They don't feel managed, influenced, or emotionally steered. They feel free to move at their own pace without risking emotional fallout. And in that freedom, something counterintuitive occurs. They begin to stay longer. They initiate more. They invest more consistently. Not because they're being pushed, but because nothing is pulling on them. Certainty is what allows avoidance to risk commitment. Not certainty about the future, but certainty about the emotional environment. When they know your presence isn't conditional, reactive, or volatile, their defenses soften. Commitment stops feeling like stepping into chaos and starts feeling like stepping into something solid. And for an avoidant nervous system, solidity is what makes staying possible. Avoidants relax when they're no longer being pursued or tested. Most dynamics with avoidance break right here, not because of lack of attraction, but because of unconscious power games that activate their deepest defenses. Chasing overwhelms them. It compresses space, accelerates intimacy, and signals expectation. Their nervous system reads pursuit as pressure, even when it's framed as affection. On the other side, withdrawing to provoke closeness triggers something just as destabilizing. It lights up abandonment alarms, unpredictability, and emotional volatility. So the avoidant finds themselves stuck between two threats. Move closer and feel engulfed, or move away and feel destabilized. Either way, their system stays activated. What almost no one offers is neutrality, a grounded presence that isn't chasing and isn't disappearing. No strategizing, no trying to pull a response out of them, no energy shifts designed to manage their behavior. This state is unfamiliar to avoidance because most of their relational history has involved push-pull dynamics. Someone wanted more and reached for them, or someone pulled away and forced them to react. Neutrality interrupts that pattern completely. And because it interrupts it, it feels safe. Neutrality doesn't mean emotional flatness. It means your center stays intact regardless of what they do. You don't push for closeness to relieve your anxiety, and you don't pull away to create desire. You stay present without leaning. You remain warm without advancing. This removes the implicit contest that most relationships unknowingly become. There's no chase to escape from and no withdrawal to pursue. And without those pulls, the avoidance nervous system finally stops bracing. Avoidants are hyper-attuned to manipulation, even when it's subtle and well-intentioned. Changing tone to signal disappointment, becoming quieter to provoke pursuit, increasing affection to secure closeness. All of these are attempts to control the dynamic. And control, even emotional control, feels unsafe to someone whose core fear is losing autonomy. When you don't push for closeness, don't pull away to provoke, and don't change your energy to manage them, they sense something different. There's no hidden agenda, no emotional leverage, no test they're about to fail. This is why they stop defending. Defense requires a threat, and when there's nothing to win and nothing to lose, the threat disappears. They don't feel evaluated for closeness or punished for distance. They don't feel like intimacy is a game with rules. They don't know. They can simply exist in the connection without monitoring themselves. And that internal relaxation is what allows genuine attachment to form. Power games keep avoidance at arm's length because power implies imbalance. Someone is trying to get something, and someone is trying not to lose something. Neutrality restores balance. It tells the avoidant you're not being pulled and you're not being abandoned. That message is deeply regulating. It allows curiosity to replace vigilance. They begin to wonder instead of brace. They begin to engage instead of man. Over time, this grounded presence creates a new relational template for them. Connection isn't something to navigate carefully or defend against. It becomes something that simply exists. And in that space, attachment grows naturally. Not fast, not dramatically, but steadily. Because when there's no chase and no withdrawal, there's finally room for something real to take hold. Commitment begins when boundaries are honored without resentment. Avoidants are hyper aware of hidden costs in relationships, not because they're calculating or selfish, but because their nervous system learned early to watch for the moment closeness turns into obligation. They don't just hear what you say, they track what it costs emotionally. Every request, every need, every boundary exchange is subconsciously scanned for aftermath. Will this create guilt? Will there be emotional fallout later? Will I owe something I didn't agree to? These questions live beneath the surface of every interaction. And if the answer feels uncertain, they don't argue. They leave. This is why boundaries are the true commitment switch for avoidance. Not the boundaries they set, but how their boundaries are received. If every boundary creates guilt, emotional withdrawal, or silent scorekeeping, their system learns quickly that noseness is expensive. Guilt tells them you hurt me by protecting yourself. Withdrawal tells them you'll lose connection if you don't comply. Silent scorekeeping tells them this will be used against you later. Even when none of this is spoken, it's felt. And once it's felt, safety disappears. Avoidants don't fear boundaries. They fear the emotional debt that often follows them. The sense that space will need to be repaid with closeness later. That autonomy will come with a price tag. That freedom now means obligation later. When boundaries are honored on the surface but resented underneath, the body knows. And resentment is louder than words. It teaches them that staying means managing someone else's disappointment indefinitely. So they preemptively opt out. But when boundaries are met with calm acceptance, something powerful happens. Not performative acceptance. Not forced understanding, real neutrality, no punishment, no emotional IOUs, no shift in tone, warmth, or availability. The connection remains intact. The relationship doesn't tighten or loosen in response. This sends a signal their nervous system rarely receives. You can protect yourself here and nothing bad happens. That signal is regulating. It dissolves the expectation of this is the moment where a deep internal rewrite occurs. The belief changes from closeness equals obligation to I can be close and still be free. That belief is rare for avoidance. It contradicts their earliest templates. And because it contradicts them, it opens a new possibility. Commitment no longer feels like signing away autonomy. It feels like choosing proximity without forfeiture. This is why pressure never works. Pressure confirms their worst fear, that closeness is enforced, not chosen. Ultimatums amplify the threat by turning connection into compliance. Patience tests, where someone waits while quietly resenting, are just delayed punishment. Avoidants feel that too. They sense the unspoken tension, the future emotional bill accumulating, and once they sense it, they emotionally detach long before they physically leave. Respected boundaries without emotional debt create the opposite effect. They create trust that isn't verbal, trust that lives in the body, trust that says, I don't have to monitor myself here. When an avoidant stops monitoring, they stop defending. When they stop defending, they start attaching, not out of fear of loss, but out of genuine safety. This is the commitment switch because it removes the final barrier. Autonomy is preserved. Emotional responsibility is shared, not assigned. Freedom and connection stop being opposites. And in that environment, commitment becomes possible, not because they're pushed, but because nothing inside them is telling them to run. Avoidants don't commit to people, they commit to nervous system safety. This is the piece most people miss. Avoidants aren't making conscious calculations about who deserves commitment. They're responding to an internal safety system that decides first and explains later. Their body chooses before their mind agrees. When safety is present, they lean in naturally, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, quietly, and in ways that feel authentic to them. And when safety isn't present, no amount of logic, reassurance, or love can override the signal to pull away. Staying only becomes possible when staying doesn't feel like self-betrayal. For an avoidant, self-betrayal isn't about losing someone else. It's about losing themselves. Every time closeness has required them to suppress needs, manage someone else's emotions, or sacrifice autonomy, their system has learned that connection equals danger. So commitment has never felt romantic. It has felt like a slow erosion of freedom. When that equation changes, their behavior changes with it. What you've seen throughout these triggers isn't strategy, it's regulation. Autonomy removes the fear of entrapment. Emotional self-sufficiency removes the fear of responsibility. Consistency removes the fear of volatility. Neutral presence removes the fear of control. Respected boundaries remove the fear of debt. Together, these conditions create something avoidants rarely experience in relationships, a state where nothing inside them is activated to defend. And when defense is no longer necessary, attachment can finally take root. This is why trying to change an avoidant never works. Pressure activates resistance, persuasion activates skepticism, chasing activates overwhelm, withdrawing activates distrust. All of those approaches focus on their behavior rather than the environment their nervous system is responding to. But when the environment changes, the behavior follows without force. They don't need to be convinced. Their body already knows whether it's safe to stay. And this is also why this work isn't about fixing them or waiting patiently for potential. It's about who you become in the process. Someone grounded, someone emotionally sovereign, someone whose presence doesn't demand vigilance. When you no longer require them to regulate you, reassure you, or manage your emotional world, you stop feeling like a threat to their autonomy. When your consistency doesn't hinge on their closeness, you stop feeling like a risk. When your boundaries are respected without resentment, you stop feeling expensive. Avoidants don't move toward intensity, they move toward relief. Relief from pressure, relief from expectation, relief from the fear that intimacy will cost them something they can't afford to lose. When your presence provides that relief, commitment stops being a concept and starts being a felt experience. They don't think I should stay, they feel I can stay. This is the difference between attachment that collapses and attachment that holds. One is built on persuasion and effort. The other is built on safety and truth. And safety can't be demanded, it can only be embodied. When you embody it, you become someone who doesn't need to chase, test, or wait. You become someone whose presence is enough. That's why this works. Not because avoidants change who they are, but because they no longer have to protect themselves from who you are.